As we reach the end of our journey through these pivotal days of April 1961 and their far-reaching consequences, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on the profound lessons embedded in this story. The Bay of Pigs invasion was, by any measure, a failure. But it was a failure that taught the world, and particularly its leaders, essential truths about the nature of power, responsibility, and the delicate art of international relations. Perhaps the most striking aspect of this entire saga is how a relatively small operation, 1,400 men landing on a remote beach, could set in motion events that would bring the world to the very edge of nuclear destruction. This reminds us that in our interconnected world, no action exists in isolation. Every decision, every policy, every military operation sends ripples across the global pond, often in ways that its architects never intended or imagined. President Kennedy's evolution from the Bay of Pigs to the Cuban Missile Crisis represents one of the most remarkable examples of learning under pressure in modern political history. The young president, who had been overwhelmed by competing advice and uncertain intelligence in April 1961, became the careful, methodical leader who navigated the world through its most dangerous nuclear crisis in October 1962. Kennedy himself reflected on this transformation in later interviews. He spoke about how the Bay of Pigs had taught him to question everything, to demand multiple perspectives, and never to accept assurances from any single source, no matter how authoritative they might seem. The first advice I'm going to give my successor, Kennedy reportedly said, is to watch the generals and to avoid feeling that because they were military men, their opinions on military matters were worth a damn. The human cost of the Bay of Pigs invasion should never be forgotten in our analysis of its political and strategic implications. 114 members of Brigade 2506 died on those beaches, and more than 1,100 were captured and imprisoned. These were not abstract strategic assets. They were husbands, fathers, sons and brothers who believed they were fighting for their homeland's freedom. Their sacrifice reminds us that behind every policy decision and strategic calculation are real people whose lives hang in the balance. The surviving members of Brigade 2506 would eventually be ransomed back to the United States in December 1962 in exchange for medical supplies and baby food worth $53 million. Kennedy welcomed them at a ceremony in Miami, where he accepted the brigade's flag and promised that it would one day fly over a free Cuba. It was a promise that would never be fulfilled, but it reflected Kennedy's genuine sense of responsibility for the men who had suffered because of his decisions. For Fidel Castro, the Bay of Pigs invasion became a defining moment that shaped the rest of his long political career. The failed invasion provided him with a powerful narrative of resistance against American imperialism, a narrative that helped legitimize his increasingly authoritarian rule. Castro would govern Cuba for nearly 5 more decades, outlasting 10 American presidents and becoming one of the longest-serving leaders in modern history. The Soviet Union, too, drew lasting lessons from the Bay of Pigs and its aftermath. Khrushchev's initial assessment of Kennedy as weak and indecisive would prove to be dangerously wrong, but it influenced Soviet policy for years to come. The missile crisis that grew out of the Bay of Pigs failure ultimately led to a more stable relationship between the superpowers, based on mutual recognition of the need to avoid nuclear confrontation. The CIA underwent significant changes in the wake of the Bay of Pigs failure. Allen Dulles, who had led the agency since its creation, was forced to resign. The agency's procedures for covert operations were completely overhauled, with new requirements for rigorous analysis and presidential oversight. The days when the CIA could launch major operations with minimal political supervision were over. Perhaps most importantly, the Bay of Pigs invasion demonstrated the limits of American power and the dangers of assuming that other peoples would welcome American intervention. The CIA's assumption that Cubans would rise up against Castro was based on wishful thinking rather than solid intelligence. This lesson would be forgotten and relearned many times over the succeeding decades in places like Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The story of the Bay of Pigs also illustrates the importance of understanding the perspectives and motivations of other countries and leaders. American policymakers consistently underestimated Castro's political skills, his genuine popularity among many Cubans, and his ability to survive external pressure. They also failed to anticipate how the invasion would affect Soviet calculations about Cuba's strategic value. As we consider these events from the perspective of more than 6 decades later, we can see how they fit into the broader pattern of Cold War history. The Bay of Pigs was neither the first nor the last time that the superpowers would come dangerously close to direct confrontation. But it was perhaps the most instructive, because it showed how quickly local conflicts could escalate into global crises, and how the decisions of a few individuals could affect the fate of millions. The beaches of the Bay of Pigs are quiet now. The coral reefs that damaged so many landing craft still guard the shore, and the swamps where some members of Brigade 2506 tried to escape are largely unchanged. But the lessons of those 3 days in April 1961 continue to resonate, reminding us of the weight of leadership, the complexity of international relations, and the precious fragility of peace. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll carry with you not just the story of this failed invasion, but the deeper truths it reveals about human nature, political power, and the eternal struggle between nations and ideologies. History, after all, is not just about what happened in the past. It's about understanding the forces that continue to shape our world today. The Bay of Pigs reminds us that even in our modern age of precision weapons and instant communication, the fog of war remains as thick as ever, and the unintended consequences of well-intentioned actions can echo through history for generations to come. Rest well, knowing that the leaders who came after Kennedy and Khrushchev learned from their example, and that the world, though still dangerous, has managed to step back from the nuclear brink that seemed so terrifyingly close in those April days of 1961.